August 12, 1847, Magnolia Creek Plantation, deep in the Mississippi Delta. On a sweltering summer night, Colonel Richard Beaumont's wife gave birth to two infant boys, one as pale as moonlight, the other as dark as river mud. Within 72 hours, 4 people would be dead. Within 2 weeks, 17 more would vanish without a trace. The county records from that month were sealed on the governor's personal order and remained locked away for 93 years. What those documents eventually revealed about superfecundation, a rare medical phenomenon in which twins are fathered by 2 different men, was nothing compared to what they continued to hide. Systematic murders, a conspiracy of silence, and a rebellion that nearly reduced the entire Delta to ash. But before we go further into the story of Magnolia Creek and the night that changed everything, make sure you're subscribed to Horror Echoes. Hit that notification bell and drop a comment below telling us what state you're listening from, because what unfolded in Mississippi in 1847 may have connections to buried secrets in your own hometown. The events of that August didn't begin with a birth. They began 7 months earlier in the cold mathematics of cruelty that defined every plantation in the antebellum South. Magnolia Creek stretched across 4,000 acres of some of the most fertile soil in Issaquah County. The Beaumont family had held that land since 1801, when Richard's grandfather acquired it from a French trading company for $30 and a promise made to the territorial governor. By 1847, the plantation held 263 enslaved people, produced 18,000 bales of cotton each year, and had earned a reputation for what local newspapers diplomatically described as efficient management practices. Colonel Richard Beaumont had inherited the plantation at 29 after his father suffered a fatal stroke while beating a field hand who'd missed quota by 15 pounds. Richard had served briefly in the Second Seminole War, earning his commission less through battlefield distinction than through his family's political connections to Senator Jefferson Davis. He stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stern handsomeness that made women at church socials quickly look away. His hair, prematurely silver at 34, lent him an air of distinguished authority he wielded like a weapon. But it was his eyes people remembered most, pale gray, nearly colorless, with a flatness that hinted at something fundamentally absent behind them. His own overseer, a German immigrant named Klaus Hoffmann, once confided to his wife that looking into the colonel's eyes was like peering into a well with no bottom and no water, just an endless drop into nothing. Colonel Beaumont had married Catherine Stratford in the spring of 1843. She came from old Charleston money, a family whose wealth flowed from rice plantations and the domestic slave trade. Catherine was 22 on her wedding day, educated at a finishing school in Richmond, fluent in French, accomplished at the pianoforte. She had honey-colored hair worn in elaborate braids, a slender figure that the fashion of the era accentuated with tight corseting, and a smile that never quite reached her hazel eyes. The marriage had been arranged by their families, a merger of Delta cotton and low country rice, of political influence and social standing. Romance had nothing to do with it. Catherine moved into Magnolia Creek's grand house, a 2-story Greek Revival structure with 6 massive columns across the front and a widow's walk that nobody ever used, and tried to make peace with her new life. The Mississippi Delta in 1847 was a world of contradictions that would have bewildered any outsider. Immense wealth existed alongside brutal poverty. Grand balls and poetry readings took place in houses built by enslaved craftsmen who couldn't read their own names. Churches preached Christian mercy on Sunday mornings, and their congregants returned to plantations where human beings were worked to death by Thursday. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system had produced a society that was, at its core, deeply unstable and paranoid. Issaquah County was particularly isolated, even by Delta standards. The Mississippi River dominated everything: commerce, transportation, social life, and the ever-present threat of floods that could wipe out a year's harvest in a single night. The nearest substantial town was Vicksburg, 40 miles down river, reachable only by steamboat or a treacherous road that became impassable mud for months at a time. That isolation bred insularity. The dozen or so plantation families in the area socialized almost exclusively with one another, intermarried, conducted business together, and presented a unified front on all matters concerning slavery, politics, and the increasingly hostile rhetoric drifting down from the North. In this closed world, reputation was everything. A whisper of scandal could ruin a family's standing. An accusation of abolitionist sympathy could result in social exile or worse. And any threat to the racial hierarchy that undergirded the entire system was met with swift, often violent response. Catherine Beaumont understood these rules. She'd been raised inside them, trained in the delicate art of maintaining appearances while ignoring ugly realities. But understanding rules and living comfortably within them were two very different things. Her first year at Magnolia Creek passed in a haze of supervised activity and suffocating routine. She managed the household staff, 6 enslaved women who cooked, cleaned, and kept the house in order. She received visitors on Thursday afternoons. She attended Deer Creek Baptist every Sunday, where Reverend Amos Pritchard delivered sermons that somehow justified slavery through selective biblical interpretation. She hosted dinner parties for neighboring planters and their wives, serving elaborate meals on imported china while pretending not to hear the screams that occasionally drifted up from the quarter after dark, and she tried without success to produce an heir. The colonel wanted a son. He made this clear in ways both explicit and implied. He needed a boy to carry on the Beaumont name, to inherit the plantation, to secure the family's position. When Catherine failed to conceive in the first 6 months of marriage, he grew impatient. When a full year passed with no pregnancy, his impatience curdled into something colder and more dangerous. She finally became pregnant in the summer of 1844. The pregnancy was difficult morning sickness that lasted all day, debilitating fatigue, swelling in her legs that made walking painful. But she endured it, believing a child would soften the colonel, would give their marriage some purpose beyond social obligation and dynastic continuation. She gave birth in March of 1845 to a girl. They named her Margaret after the colonel's mother. The baby was small, born a month premature, with a weak cry that worried the midwife. But Catherine loved her immediately with a fierce protectiveness she hadn't known she possessed. For 3 weeks, she barely left the nursery. She nursed Margaret herself, despite the colonel's insistence that they engage a wet nurse. She rocked her daughter through sleepless nights, sang to her, prayed over her. On April 8, 1845, Catherine woke to find Margaret cold in her cradle. The baby had died in the night. No marks, no signs of distress. The doctor who examined the tiny body called it crib death. A tragic but not uncommon occurrence with premature infants. Catherine knew otherwise. She had heard the colonel enter the nursery around 2 in the morning. She'd heard the floorboards creak, heard the cradle shift slightly, heard him leave again. She'd been in that half-waking state that new mothers inhabit, one ear always open for their child's cry. But she'd been too exhausted to rise, assuming he was simply checking on the baby. By dawn, Margaret was gone. Catherine said nothing, not to the doctor, not to the midwife, not to anyone. What could she have said? She had no proof, only a mother's instinct and the memory of footsteps in the dark, and even with proof, who would have believed her or cared? This was Mississippi in 1845. A man's authority over his household was absolute. If the colonel had decided his daughter was too weak to survive, too much of a disappointment to be worth keeping, that was his prerogative. But Catherine knew, and that knowledge changed something fundamental inside her. She went through the motions of grief, wore black, accepted condolences, allowed the colonel to bury Margaret in the family plot beneath a small marble headstone. But privately, she began to see her husband clearly for the first time, not as a stern but ultimately reasonable man, not as a product of his culture and upbringing, as something else entirely, something broken and dangerous. She became pregnant again in late 1845. This time she was more careful. She ate in her room, refused medicines the colonel offered, locked her door at night. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage at 4 months. The doctor said these things happened, especially after the trauma of losing a child. Catherine suspected otherwise, but again, she had no proof. Only a lingering metallic taste in her mouth after drinking the tea the colonel had brought her the night before the cramping started. By the spring of 1847, their marriage existed only as a legal fact and a social performance. They spoke when necessary. They appeared together at church and social functions, but the house had become a battlefield, even if only one of them was openly fighting. And then Catherine met Solomon Tutwiler. Solomon was not what anyone imagined when they heard the word driver. The position an enslaved man appointed to help manage other enslaved people, a middle tier in the plantation's brutal hierarchy, typically went to large, physically imposing men who could enforce discipline through force. Solomon was tall, yes, nearly 6.5 feet, but lean rather than bulky, with long fingers better suited to piano keys than whips. But it was precisely his intelligence that made him valuable to Klaus Hoffman and terrifying to the enslaved people of Magnolia Creek. Solomon had been purchased at 15 from a South Carolina plantation, part of a lot the colonel acquired in 1838. His previous owner had noted in the bill of sale that the boy could read, a dangerous liability in South Carolina following the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, but also that he possessed a remarkable talent for understanding complex systems and anticipating behavior. The colonel had recognized potential in this. Not humanitarian potential, economic potential. A smart slave could be worth more than 10 strong ones if properly controlled and directed. By 1847, Solomon Tutwiler, 24 years old, effectively ran the day-to-day operations of Magnolia Creek's enslaved workforce. He reported to Hoffman, who reported to the colonel, but in practice, Solomon made most of the decisions, work assignments, discipline, logistics. He maintained the plantation's records, who produced what, who missed quota, who was sick or pregnant or dead. He could calculate yield projections, optimal planting patterns, maintenance schedules. He could also identify exactly which enslaved person was most likely to run, to rebel, or to slow production. And he knew precisely how to prevent all three. The other enslaved people hated him with an intensity that went beyond the usual resentment directed at drivers. Solomon wasn't merely enforcing the system. He understood it, manipulated it, and used it for his own survival. He reported escape plans before they fully formed. He identified potential leaders of resistance and brought them to Hoffman's attention before they could organize. He administered punishments with a clinical efficiency that was somehow worse than rage. He also possessed something unusual for an enslaved person in 1847, Mississippi, a measure of physical freedom. Because of his value to the plantation's operations, Solomon was permitted to move between the main house, the overseer's cottage, the quarters, the fields, and occasionally even to neighboring plantations on the colonel's business. He wore better clothes than other enslaved people, not fine but clean and serviceable. He ate better food, had his own small room in the quarters, and had never been whipped, except once early on to establish the colonel's authority. This combination of intelligence, mobility, and apparent collaboration made Solomon the most dangerous person on Magnolia Creek. Just not for the reasons anyone assumed. Catherine first became aware of Solomon in December of 1846, when she'd gone to the quarters to distribute Christmas gifts, a paternalistic tradition inherited from her mother-in-law. She'd brought cheap trinkets and extra food rations, playing her part in the elaborate theater of benevolent slavery. The enslaved people had lined up, thanked her with dead eyes, and accepted their gifts with practiced humility. But Solomon had looked at her differently, not with the submission she was accustomed to, and not with the barely concealed hatred she sometimes glimpsed in others. He'd looked at her with recognition, as though he could see past the performance to the desperate, grieving woman underneath. As though he knew about Margaret, about the miscarriage, about the tea. It lasted only a moment, then he'd lowered his eyes, thanked her, and moved on. That moment cracked something open inside Catherine. She began to notice him after that, the quiet efficiency with which he moved through the plantation. The way other enslaved people fell silent when he approached. The respect, or was it fear, in Hoffman's voice whenever he addressed Solomon. The colonel's unusual reliance on this one man who, despite being held as property, seemed to carry genuine power. In January, she orchestrated their first private conversation. She'd requested that someone literate be sent to help her catalog her late mother-in-law's library, a task that required reading titles and organizing volumes alphabetically. She knew Solomon was the only enslaved person at Magnolia Creek who could read. The colonel approved the request without suspicion, assuming his wife was simply being practical. Solomon arrived at the library on a cold Tuesday afternoon. For the first hour, they worked in silence. Catherine would hand him a book. He would note the title and author in careful script, and they would place it in alphabetical order on the shelves. Then Catherine asked, "Did you choose this life?" Solomon set his pen down carefully. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "I'm not sure I understand the question, ma'am. Being the driver, the colonel's assistant, did you volunteer for that position or were you assigned to it?" A long pause. When Solomon spoke again, his voice was very quiet, very precise. "I was assigned to it, ma'am. When they discovered I could read, the colonel decided I'd be more useful in this capacity than in the fields, and you've been successful in this role." "I have kept myself alive, ma'am. I'm not certain that counts as success." The honesty in that statement, the first genuinely honest thing anyone had said to Catherine in months, made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. She turned away quickly, pretending to search for a particular volume. "Did you have children, ma'am?" Solomon asked, still in that quiet voice. "Before I came to work at the main house, I've only been here since last year." The question should have been impertinent, crossing every boundary of racial and social etiquette. But something in his tone made it feel less like an intrusion and more like solidarity. "A daughter," Catherine whispered. "She died. I'm very sorry." And somehow she knew he genuinely was. They continued working in silence after that, but something had shifted between them. An understanding had been established, wordless, but real. Over the weeks that followed, Catherine found reasons to require Solomon's assistance more frequently. The colonel, distracted by falling cotton prices and political tensions with Mexico, took no notice or simply didn't care. Hoffman assumed it was the usual plantation lady's busy work, organizing closets, cataloging silver, sorting through correspondence. During these sessions they talked, carefully at first, then with increasing candor. Catherine learned that Solomon had been born in Charleston, that his mother had taught him to read in secret before she was sold away when he was 7, that he'd lived on 5 different plantations before Magnolia Creek, that he'd survived by being smarter than his owners, by making himself indispensable, by understanding the system better than the people who had created it. Solomon learned that Catherine was terrified of her husband, that she believed the colonel had murdered their daughter, that she was trapped in a life she hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. "Why don't you run?" Catherine asked him one afternoon in March. "You're intelligent enough to make it north. You move freely. You could plan it properly." Solomon smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ma'am, smart slaves don't run. They know the statistics. For every one who reaches freedom, 99 are caught and made into examples. Running is what desperate people do. I prefer to survive." "So you've accepted this forever." "I didn't say that." His eyes met hers with sudden intensity. "I said I don't run. I didn't say I don't resist." That conversation took place on March 19th, 1847. The same day, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. Catherine didn't tell Solomon about the pregnancy right away. She didn't tell anyone, not even the colonel, for nearly 6 weeks. She'd learned caution from her previous losses, and this time she was determined to protect the life growing inside her through vigilance and secrecy. But she also knew with growing certainty that if this child was a son, the heir the colonel demanded, she would never have real influence over him. The boy would be raised to be exactly like his father, entitled, cruel, emotionally vacant. He would inherit Magnolia Creek and perpetuate the cycle of brutality. And if the child was a daughter, Catherine feared she wouldn't live long enough to shield her from the colonel's cold calculations about bloodlines and utility. This fear festered through April and into May, growing alongside the child in her womb, even as she played her role impeccably, the beautiful wife, the gracious hostess, the quiet presence at church. But inside, she was making calculations of her own. The idea, when it first took shape, seemed impossible, insane, but it wouldn't leave her alone. She'd been reading medical texts from the colonel's library, trying to understand what had gone wrong with her earlier pregnancies. That was when she encountered a reference to superfecundation, the rare phenomenon in which a woman conceives twins from two different fathers, having released multiple eggs and been intimate with two men within a narrow window of time. The medical text, written by a French physician in 1823, documented only 3 cases, all in Europe. The phenomenon was considered so rare and so scandalous it was barely discussed in polite medical circles. But its implications consumed Catherine's thoughts for days. If she could conceive twins, one from the colonel, one from another man, there was a chance, however slim, that one child might be spared her husband's influence. If one twin was visibly not the colonel's, he might reject that child entirely, might send it away or allow Catherine to raise it separately. That child at least would not grow up to become another Richard Beaumont. It was a desperate plan, built on statistical improbabilities and fragile hope. But Catherine was desperate. On May 23rd, during one of their library sessions, Catherine asked Solomon a question that would alter both their lives. "If I asked you to help me destroy something," she said, not looking at him, ostensibly focused on dusting a row of leather-bound volumes, "would you?" Solomon went very still. "That would depend on what you wanted destroyed, ma'am. A legacy. A continuation of cruelty." "You're speaking in riddles." Catherine turned to face him then, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I'm pregnant. 2 months along. The baby is the colonel's." Solomon's face remained carefully neutral. "Congratulations, ma'am." "I don't want congratulations. I want help." She explained it then, haltingly at first, then with growing urgency. The theory of superfecundation, the medical texts, her desperate plan to conceive a second child from a different father, to create uncertainty, to carve out some measure of leverage and agency in a world that offered her none. "You're asking me to..." Solomon didn't finish the sentence. "I'm asking you to help me betray my husband in a way that might save at least one child from becoming like him." The silence that followed felt eternal. Catherine could hear her own breathing, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sound of field workers singing as they moved through the cotton. "Do you understand what you're asking?" Solomon's voice was barely a whisper. "What would happen to both of us if this were ever discovered?" "I understand you'd be killed, probably tortured first. I understand I'd be socially destroyed, possibly institutionalized. I understand this is the most dangerous thing either of us could do." "Then why?" "Because I watched my husband murder our daughter." The words came out sharp and certain. "Because I will not bring another child into this house without some way, any way, to protect them from him. Because I am already destroyed, Solomon. I'm just still walking around." Solomon looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he asked very quietly, "Is this truly about saving a child, or is it about revenge?" Catherine considered the question honestly. "Both. Does it matter?" "Yes, ma'am, it matters a great deal. Revenge is a fire that consumes everything, including the person who lights it. If that's all this is, we'll both burn and accomplish nothing." "Then call it survival," Catherine said. "Mine and the child's. Is that acceptable?" Another long silence. Then Solomon nodded, once, almost imperceptibly. "When?" he asked. "Soon. The timing has to be precise. Within the next week, possibly less." They made their plans carefully over the following days. Catherine tracked her body's rhythms and calculated the optimal window. Solomon identified the safest time and location. A Wednesday afternoon when the colonel would be in Vicksburg meeting with his banker, when Hoffman would be occupied supervising new field assignments, when the house staff would be busy with laundry in the quarters behind the main house. On May 27, 1847, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, Catherine and Solomon met in the disused smokehouse at the edge of the plantation's main compound. The structure, built 30 years earlier and replaced by a larger facility nearer the kitchens, was now used only to store equipment nobody wanted but nobody bothered to discard. What happened there took less than 20 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Catherine kept her eyes closed throughout, tears leaking from beneath her eyelids. Solomon was methodical, quick, and when it was finished, he helped her adjust her dress with the same careful efficiency he brought to everything. "I'm sorry," he said as she prepared to leave. Catherine looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected. "Genuine anguish? Don't be," she told him. "This was my choice, my plan. You were just property, doing what property does," he finished bitterly. "Following orders? No." Catherine touched his hand briefly, a gesture that violated every social code both of them had been raised under. "You were a person helping another person survive, that's all." She returned to the main house, bathed thoroughly, and resumed her normal routine as though nothing had changed. That evening, the colonel came back from Vicksburg in a foul mood. The bank had refused to extend his credit line given the instability in cotton prices. He ate dinner in silence, drank a third of a bottle of whiskey, and retired to his study without a word to Catherine. She lay awake that night with one hand resting on her barely swollen belly, wondering whether she had just saved a life or condemned two. The answer wouldn't come for 4 more months. Through June and July, life at Magnolia Creek maintained its oppressive rhythm. The temperature climbed to brutal highs regularly above 100 degrees with humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. Cotton grew thick and green in the fields. Enslaved workers toiled from dawn to dusk and beyond as the colonel pushed for maximum yield to compensate for falling prices. 2 people died of heat exhaustion in late June. Another attempted escape in early July, was caught, whipped, and sold down river as a warning. Catherine's pregnancy progressed as normally as any pregnancy could in that heat, in that house, in that life. She grew larger, more uncomfortable, more aware of the clock ticking down toward a moment that would either free her or destroy her completely. She and Solomon didn't speak privately again after that afternoon in the smokehouse. It was too dangerous, too likely to draw attention. But sometimes when she spotted him crossing the yard or when he delivered reports to the colonel's study and she intercepted him in the hallway, their eyes would meet for just a fraction of a second. In those brief moments, an entire conversation passed without words. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Are you?" "Yes." "Can we survive this?" "We have no choice." The colonel, meanwhile, grew increasingly volatile as summer wore on. Cotton prices kept falling as northern abolition, agitation, disrupted markets, and southern paranoia intensified. Political tensions with Mexico remained unresolved, and his wife's pregnancy served as a daily reminder that he would soon have an heir, one who might either make him proud or disappoint him. The uncertainty seemed to corrode something in him. He had always been cruel in a distant, administrative way, signing off on punishments, making decisions about sales and separations, enforcing discipline through Hoffman and Solomon. But that summer, he began participating directly. He watched whippings now, counting the lashes himself. He rode through the fields during the hottest hours of the day, scanning the workers with those flat gray eyes, searching for any sign of shirking. He conducted late-night inspections of the quarters, looking for contraband or evidence of forbidden gatherings. The enslaved people of Magnolia Creek responded by becoming even more careful, even more invisible. They had long learned to read the colonel's moods, to know when he was dangerous, to adjust accordingly. But the constant surveillance created an atmosphere of suffocating fear that seeped into every corner of the plantation. Hoffman tried to moderate the colonel's impulses, worried that pushing too hard would produce runaways or, worse, organized rebellion. The colonel ignored him with increasing frequency, He had decided that firmness, his word for brutality, was the only way to maintain order in uncertain times. Solomon navigated this deteriorating situation with his usual careful intelligence. He gave the colonel no reason to question his loyalty. He enforced rules, reported infractions, maintained efficiency. But he had also begun doing something else. Something subtle, noticed only by someone watching very carefully. He was making mistakes, small ones. A work assignment that put the wrong person in the wrong location. A miscalculation in supplies that left field workers short of water during the hottest part of the afternoon, requiring an early break. A forgotten message that sent Hoffman to the wrong section of the plantation to supervise work, leaving another section unattended for 3 hours. Individually, each error was minor enough to be attributed to the heat, to fatigue, to the general chaos of managing a large operation. But together they created small pockets of disorder, moments where the system's rigid control slipped just slightly. Catherine noticed because she was watching Solomon constantly now, looking for any sign that their shared secret had changed him. And she gradually understood that he wasn't making mistakes at all. He was creating opportunities. In late July, she managed to catch him briefly in the hallway when he'd come to deliver household accounts to the colonel's study. "You're planning something?" she whispered. "I'm always planning something, ma'am. Survival demands it. That's not what I mean." Solomon glanced down the hallway, confirming they were alone, then met her eyes with unusual directness. "You're not the only one who wants to see something destroyed, Mrs. Beaumont. You just gave me a reason to move the timeline forward." "What timeline?" But he'd already turned away, disappearing toward the back of the house before she could press him further. The comment haunted her through the weeks that followed. What had Solomon been planning before she'd approached him? How long had he been preparing, and what exactly did he mean by accelerating the timeline? Part of her answer came in early August, just days before the twins would be born. Catherine had developed a habit during the worst of the afternoon heat of sitting on the second-floor balcony that overlooked the quarters and the fields beyond. The colonel didn't object. He assumed she was simply seeking air, and pregnant women were granted certain accommodations. But Catherine wasn't seeking comfort. She was watching. From that vantage point, she could see patterns. The way certain enslaved people moved between buildings, carrying items that might be tools or might be something else. The brief exchanges that happened when Solomon believed no one was observing. The way, over the course of several weeks, small amounts of supplies seemed to vanish from various locations. Rope, lamp oil, kitchen knives, blankets. Individually, these thefts were minor enough that Hoffman attributed them to ordinary waste and pilferage. But Catherine, with nothing to do but observe and think, began to see a larger design. Solomon wasn't merely creating small disruptions. He was stockpiling, preparing for something. On August 8th, 4 days before the twins would be born, something happened that brought the simmering tensions to a violent peak. A 15-year-old enslaved girl named Ruth had been working in the main house as a junior housemaid. She was quiet, competent, and invisible in the way that enslaved people learned to be in order to survive. But the colonel had noticed her anyway. That afternoon, while Catherine was resting in her room and the house staff was occupied with dinner preparations, the colonel had summoned Ruth to his study. When she hadn't emerged after an hour, one of the older house slaves, a woman named Bess, who had been at Magnolia Creek for 30 years, went to check on her. What she found was Ruth, sobbing and bleeding, her dress torn. The colonel stood calmly pouring himself another whiskey, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Bess helped Ruth to the kitchen, cleaned her up, and told her to say nothing to anyone. It was the same advice she had given other girls over the years. Speaking out only made things worse. Silence was survival. But Solomon had been in the kitchen fetching water for Hoffman when they arrived. He'd seen Ruth's condition, seen the blank horror in her eyes, understood immediately what had happened. and something that had been carefully contained inside him for 24 years cracked open. That evening, Solomon requested a meeting with Hoffman. He reported in his usual precise manner that Ruth was injured and would be unable to work for several days. He suggested she be given light duties until she recovered. He showed no emotion, offered no opinion, simply relayed information. But Hoffman, who had worked alongside Solomon for 9 years, heard something different in his voice, a flatness that was even flatter than usual, an absence that suggested the forceful suppression of something present beneath the surface. "Are you all right?" Hoffman asked, surprising them both with the question. "Yes, sir, just tired from the heat." "Solomon, if there's something—" "There's nothing, sir. Will that be all?" Hoffman let him go. But he sat alone in his cottage afterward, deeply uneasy. He had always known Solomon was dangerous in the way that very intelligent people trapped in impossible situations tend to be dangerous. He had believed until now that danger was fully contained, fully controlled. For the first time, he wondered whether he'd been wrong. Catherine learned about Ruth the next morning from Bess, who described it in the careful coded language enslaved people used when discussing their owners' crimes. Catherine felt something cold and final settle in her chest. This was who her husband was. This was what she was trying to protect her unborn children from. That evening, she wrote a letter to her brother in Charleston, something she had never done before. Since the Colonel read all her correspondence, she hid it in her sewing basket, unsure whether she'd ever find a way to send it, but needing to put the truth somewhere outside her own mind. The letter read in part, "Dear Thomas, I am writing to tell you that if anything should happen to me during childbirth, you must know it was not God's will or natural misfortune. I have reason to believe my husband is not a safe person. I cannot explain further in writing, but please know that if I die, it will not have been an accident. Please look after my children if there are any. Please do not allow Richard to raise them alone. Your loving sister, Catherine." She sealed the letter and hid it between the pages of her Bible, a book she knew the Colonel would never touch. 3 days later, on the night of August 11th, Catherine went into labor. The contractions began just after sunset, a familiar tightening across her abdomen that she had felt twice before. She was in the music room pretending to read when the first real pain seized her. She gasped, gripping the arm of her chair, and the book fell from her hands. Bess, who had been dusting nearby, understood immediately. "I'll fetch the midwife, ma'am, and inform the Colonel." "No." Catherine's voice was sharp. "Not yet, not the Colonel, just the midwife. Tell him I'm feeling poorly and have retired early. Don't tell him about the labor until it's further along." Bess looked at her strangely. Most women wanted their husbands notified at once, but she nodded and hurried out. The midwife, an older enslaved woman named Dina, who had delivered half the babies born at Magnolia Creek over the past 2 decades, arrived within 20 minutes. She examined Catherine quickly, efficiently, then settled into a chair by the bed. "First babies usually take a while," she said calmly. "But you've done this before, ma'am. Your body knows what to do." But Catherine had done this before, and both previous pregnancies had ended in death. She couldn't shake the feeling that this labor would be different, not just because of the superfecundation, but because of everything else. The violence simmering beneath Magnolia Creek's surface, the plans already set in motion, the secrets buried deep and about to be violently exhumed. The hours crept forward. Contractions grew stronger, closer together. Catherine paced when she could, gripped the bedpost when she couldn't, tried to breathe through each wave of pain. Dina remained steady, experienced, checking her progress at intervals. Around midnight, Bess finally informed the Colonel. He had been in his study working through accounts and received the news with his typical flat effect. "How much longer?" he asked. "Hard to say, sir. Could be hours yet. First babies take their time." The Colonel nodded once, poured himself another whiskey, and returned to his paperwork. He did not go upstairs to check on his wife. He sent no word of encouragement or reassurance. He simply waited, the way one might wait for a crop report or a business transaction to conclude. But while the main house was focused on Catherine's labor, something else was happening in the quarters. Solomon was making his usual rounds, checking that everyone was in their assigned cabins for the night, that no fires burned that shouldn't, that order was being maintained. But his route took him past every cabin, and at each one he paused for just a moment. To a casual observer, he was simply being thorough. But at each door he was delivering a message, whispered, "Tonight, be ready when you hear the bell." There was no bell at Magnolia Creek. The plantation used a horn to signal work times, but everyone who received the message understood what Solomon meant. The bell was a metaphor, a signal, a beginning. By 2 in the morning, Catherine's labor had intensified to the point where she could no longer contain her screams. The sounds carried through the house, through the open windows, out across the yard. Women in the quarters who had given birth themselves flinched in sympathy. Men who had heard such sounds before, accompanying births, deaths, whippings, tried not to listen. Hoffman, sleeping fitfully in his cottage, heard the screams and felt unease that he couldn't quite account for. Something felt wrong beyond the ordinary wrongness of a difficult birth. The air itself seemed charged, oppressive like the minutes before a lightning strike. At 3:15 in the morning, Dina examined Catherine's progress and announced that it was time to push. Catherine, exhausted, terrified, and in more pain than she had ever known, bore down with everything she had. The first baby came quickly after that, a boy, small but healthy, crying with a strong, lusty voice as Dina cleared his airways and wrapped him in clean linen. Catherine, trembling and soaked with sweat, reached for her son with desperate hands. "A boy, ma'am," Dina said, smiling. "Strong lungs on this one. The colonel will be pleased." But before Catherine could take him, another contraction seized her, stronger than any that had come before. She cried out in confusion. The baby was born. Why was she still in such pain? Dina's eyes widened. "Ma'am, there's another one. You're carrying twins." The next 10 minutes were a blur of pain and pressure and animal effort. Catherine pushed until she thought the effort alone might kill her, until the world narrowed to nothing but her body's overwhelming imperative to bring this second life into it. The second baby arrived at 3:47 in the morning. Another boy, slightly larger than the first, also crying, also apparently healthy. But when Dina wiped the blood and fluid from the second infant and saw his skin darker than his brother's, unmistakably darker, her hands went still. Catherine saw the midwife's expression and felt her heart stop. "Let me see him." Dina hesitated, then placed the second baby in Catherine's arms. In the lamplight, the difference was subtle but undeniable. The first twin had pale skin like his father, fine blonde hair, gray eyes already showing their color. The second twin had darker skin, coffee-colored caramel, dark hair, and eyes already hinting at brown. For a moment no one spoke. Catherine held both babies, one in each arm, looking from one small face to the other. The superfecundation had worked. She had conceived twins from 2 different fathers. The medical impossibility had become medical reality. And now everyone would know. "Ma'am," Dina whispered, her voice shaking, "what have you done?" Before Catherine could answer, the bedroom door opened. The colonel stood in the doorway, still fully dressed, whiskey glass in hand. He had come to see his heir. His eyes moved to Catherine first, then to the baby she held. For a long moment his face showed nothing at all, that terrible flatness Catherine had learned to fear more than rage. Then he stepped into the room, set his glass on the dresser with exaggerated care, and approached the bed. "2 sons," Catherine said, her voice barely audible. "Twins." The colonel examined the first baby, touched his pale cheek with one finger. Then he looked at the second, and something happened to his face. Not anger exactly, something colder. A calculation occurring behind those gray eyes. "Whose is he?" The colonel's voice was very quiet. "They're both." "Don't." The word was sharp as a blade. "Don't insult me, Catherine. I may be many things, but I am not blind." He leaned closer, examining the second twin with the same detachment he might have used to inspect a suspicious cotton ball. "Whose is he?" Catherine's mind raced. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed various responses. Now that it was here, every planned word evaporated. There's a medical condition called superfecundation. I know what superfecundation is. The colonel straightened, lifted his glass, drained it. I'm not an uneducated man, Catherine. I know it's theoretically possible for twins to have different fathers, but it requires specific conditions. It requires you to have lain with two men within a very short time frame. He paused. So I'll ask you again, whose is he? Silence stretched between them. Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck 4. Solomon, Catherine finally whispered, Solomon Tutwiler. She had expected violence. A blow, shouting, immediate rage. Instead, the colonel simply nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected. Your driver, Dina breathed, backing toward the door. Lord have mercy, ma'am, you laid with Solomon. Get out, the colonel said, without turning to look at the midwife. Tell no one what you saw here. No one, do you understand? Yes, sir. Dina fled, leaving Catherine alone with her husband and hers, the babies. The colonel walked to the window and looked out at the pre-dawn darkness. When he spoke again, his voice had that administrative quality Catherine recognized from business discussions. Here's what is going to happen. You will remain in this room until I decide what to do with you. The babies will be taken to a wet nurse. No one beyond those already present tonight will see the second child, and Solomon, he paused. Solomon will be dealt with appropriately. Please, Catherine said, pulling both infants closer. Please don't hurt him. This was my idea, my plan. He was just property following orders. The colonel turned from the window, and for the first time, Catherine saw genuine emotion in his face. Not anger, not hurt. Something worse, satisfaction. Yes, I imagine that's precisely how you rationalized it, how he rationalized it. But you see, Catherine, it doesn't matter whose idea it was. A slave who touches a white woman hangs. That's the law. That's civilization, that's order. Then hang me as well, I'm equally guilty. The colonel almost smiled. Oh, my dear, you're far more useful to me alive, institutionalized perhaps, sent away to one of those asylums for women whose minds have been weakened by childbirth. That's what people will believe, of course, that the strain of bearing twins drove you to madness, to delusions of adultery. No one will believe you actually lay with a slave willingly. They'll assume you're simply insane. The calculated cruelty of it took Catherine's breath away. He was going to use her confession as proof of madness, would control the entire narrative, and Solomon would die for a crime she had initiated. You can't, she whispered. I can, I will. He moved closer to the bed and looked down at both babies with clinical interest. I'll keep the white one, raise him as my heir as though nothing unusual occurred. But the other, he reached out as if to touch the darker twin, then withdrew his hand. The other is an abomination, a stain on my family's name. I'll have him taken to the quarters, sold down river as soon as possible. He'll disappear into the cotton fields of some plantation where no one knows his origins, and he'll die there forgotten. No. Catherine pulled both babies against her chest. You cannot separate them. They're brothers. They're innocent. They are a white child and a mulatto bastard, the colonel corrected. And I'll do with both whatever serves my interests best. Now give them to me. He reached for the babies. And Catherine, exhausted, bleeding, traumatized, but still a mother, did something she had never done before. She fought back, she kicked at him, clawed at his hands, screamed for help loud enough to wake the entire house. The babies, jostled and frightened, began to cry in earnest, their wails mixing with Catherine's screams and the colonel's shouted commands. Bess burst into the room, saw the struggle, and froze in the doorway. Behind her, Hoffman appeared, drawn by the noise, his face pale in the lamplight. Sir, what's happening? Hold her down, the colonel ordered. Take the babies now. But before anyone could move, a sound cut through the chaos. A sound that had no place in this moment, in this house, in this world, the deep, resonant toll of a bell. Everyone froze. Magnolia Creek had no bell. It had never had a bell. The toll rang again, then again, steady, rhythmic, impossible. Hoffman moved to the window and looked out toward the quarters. What he saw drained the color from his face. Sir, he whispered, sir, you need to see this. The colonel released Catherine's wrist and turned toward the glass. What he saw there transformed his expression from controlled fury to something approaching shock. The quarters were on fire. Not one cabin, not an accident, every single structure was burning simultaneously. Flames climbing into the pre-dawn sky, great columns of black smoke billowing upward. And in front of the fires, silhouetted against the orange glow, dozens of figures stood in absolute silence. Watching the main house, dear God, Hoffman breathed. They're just standing there. They're not running. They're not panicking. They're just watching. The bell rang again, and now they could see its source. Someone had mounted the plantation's large iron cookpot on a wooden frame and was striking it with a metal bar, sending deep, resonant tones rolling across the entire plantation. "It's a signal," the colonel said, his voice flat again. "They've organized. This is rebellion." As if to confirm his words, the silent watchers began to move, not toward the main house in a panicked mob, but in organized groups, spreading across the plantation with unmistakable purpose. Some headed toward the equipment barns, others toward the cotton stores, still others began advancing on the main house itself. "We need to barricade the doors," Hoffman said, backing from the window. "Get the weapons, sir. We need to." "Where's Solomon?" The colonel's question cut through Hoffman's panic. "Where is Solomon Tutwiler?" As if in answer, a figure emerged from the smoke and flames, walking slowly up the path from the quarters toward the main house. Even through the haze, even at a distance, they recognized him. Solomon, tall, unhurried, carrying something in his hands. The colonel watched him approach with that calculating expression. He planned this, all of it, the fire, the organization. This is what he's been preparing for. "We need to leave." Hoffman insisted. "Sir, we cannot defend against this many." "No." The colonel's voice was ice. "We are not leaving. This is my property, my land, my slaves, and I will not be driven from it by—" His words were cut off by the sound of breaking glass downstairs, voices, footsteps. The rebellion had reached the house. Catherine, still in bed, still holding both babies, felt a strange calm settle over her. This was it. The moment everything converged: her betrayal, Solomon's long-laid plans, the colonel's cruelty, the system's violence, all of it reaching critical mass simultaneously. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Magnolia Creek intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a story like this. Let's find out together what happens next. The colonel grabbed Hoffman's arm. "Get downstairs. Protect the weapons cabinet. I'll be right behind you." When Hoffman left, the colonel turned back to Catherine. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment both of them understood that everything they had built, the marriage, the plantation, the carefully maintained facades, was collapsing. "This is your fault," he said quietly. "Your betrayal started this." "No," Catherine replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Your cruelty started this years ago with Margaret, with Ruth, with every person you've brutalized. I just gave Solomon a reason to act on a plan he'd been building for years. You created this. I only accelerated it." The colonel stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out, locking the door behind him, trapping her in the bedroom with her newborn sons. She was still sitting there, both babies in her arms, when she heard the first gunshot from downstairs. The next hour unfolded like a nightmare rendered in fire and blood, and the breaking of things that had been held rigid far too long. Hoffman had reached the weapons cabinet, a locked cherrywood case in the colonel's study containing 2 rifles, 3 pistols, ammunition, and the leather-bound ledgers documenting every enslaved person ever owned by the Beaumont family. He'd armed himself and taken position at the study door, prepared to defend the house. But the enslaved people of Magnolia Creek did not attack directly. They did something more strategic, more devastating. They locked all the exterior doors from the outside and set fire to the first floor. Solomon had planned this carefully. He had studied the house's layout during months of access, had identified its weak points and its death traps. The main house, like most plantation homes in the Delta, was built almost entirely of wood cypress beams, pine floors, oak paneling. It would burn fast once the fire fully took hold. The flames started in the kitchen, where Solomon's people poured lamp oil across the floor and walls before igniting it. The fire spread to the dining room, the parlor, the colonel's study. Smoke began filling the lower floor almost immediately, thick, black, and choking. Hoffman, realizing too late that he had trapped himself, tried to shoot through the locked study door. The first shot splintered the wood but didn't break the lock. The second did, but by then the hallway beyond was already engulfed. He staggered back into the study, coughing, eyes streaming, and made his way to the window. He got it open, prepared to jump the 15 feet to the ground, and found Solomon waiting below. "Don't," Solomon said simply. He held a pistol, one Hoffman recognized from the plantation's own stores, stolen weeks ago in one of those thefts attributed to ordinary pilferage. "You can jump and die quickly, or you can burn and die slowly. Either way, you're dying tonight." Klaus Hoffman, German immigrant, a man who had survived poverty and cholera and the brutal passage to America, who had believed himself practical and realistic about the system he participated in, stared at the man he had worked beside for 9 years. "I treated you fairly," he said, and actually believed it. Solomon's expression didn't change. "You treated me like I was intelligent property instead of stupid property. That's not fairness, Klaus. That's just a different kind of exploitation." "So this is justice, murder?" "No," Solomon said quietly. "This is survival. You just happened to be in the way." The smoke drove Hoffman back from the window. Through the haze, he watched Solomon turn and walk away, leaving him to his choice of deaths. Hoffman chose the fire. It seemed faster than the fall, and died in the colonel's study, surrounded by account books that had documented the buying and selling of human beings as though they were livestock. The colonel himself had moved more intelligently. When smoke began filling the first floor, he'd immediately gone upstairs, where the fire was slower to spread. He'd broken the lock on Catherine's door, his own lock on his own cage, and entered to find her still sitting in bed, both babies quiet in her arms, calm as death. "We need to leave," he said. "Now?" "How?" Catherine asked. "You locked the doors. Your own people set this fire. Where exactly are we supposed to go?" The colonel moved to the window, assessed the drop to the ground, too far with an injured wife and 2 infants. He looked toward the widow's walk, the decorative balcony on the roof that no one ever used. If they could reach it, they might be able to climb down the main columns. "Can you walk?" "I don't know, probably not far." "Then I'll carry you and the babies." Catherine laughed, a sound entirely without humor. "Now you want to save both of them, even the one you called an abomination. They're my property," the colonel said flatly. "All 3 of you. I don't surrender property to slaves. Now move." But Catherine didn't move. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, and made a decision. "No," the colonel turned from the window, shock registering on his face. "What did you say?" "I said no, I'm not going with you. I'm not allowing you to take these babies and raise them in your image or sell them or destroy them. I'm done, Richard. I've been dead inside this house for years. The only difference now is that the house is burning too. You're hysterical. The childbirth, the trauma. I'm clear. Headed for the first time in my life." Catherine stood shakily, both babies secure in her arms. "I'm going to walk out of this house. I'm going to find Solomon, and I'm going to trust him with my sons' lives more than I have ever trusted you." The colonel's face broke open then, the flat effect finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "You'd trust a slave over your own husband. You'd condemn your sons to lives as what? Free, unknown, away from you." Catherine moved toward the door, each step agonizing but deliberate. "Yes, absolutely yes." The colonel blocked her path. "You're not leaving. Then we'll burn together, at least we'll be warm." For a moment they stood frozen, husband and wife, owner and property. 2 people who had destroyed each other through calculated cruelties and desperate rebellions. The smoke was creeping up the stairs now, visible through the open door. The heat had become unbearable. The house groaned around them as timber began to fail. Then the colonel did something Catherine had never once seen him do. He stepped aside. "Go," he said quietly. "Take them, but know this, Catherine, if you survive this night, if you escape with my property, I will spend the rest of my life hunting you. I will use every resource, every connection, every legal mechanism available to find you and bring you back. You will never be free of me." "Yes, I will," Catherine said. "Because you're going to die in this house tonight. You can't know that. I can." She moved past him toward the door, leaving a trail of blood on the floor. She'd torn stitches standing, but she didn't care. "Because you'll never leave. You'll die trying to save your ledgers, your documents, your proof of ownership. That's who you are, Richard. That's all you are, and it's going to kill you." She didn't look back to see if she was right. She simply walked through the door, down the smoke-filled hallway, toward the stairs and the flames and whatever waited beyond. The colonel stood alone in the bedroom for nearly a full minute, Catherine's words echoing around him. Then, as she had predicted, he turned not toward escape, but toward his study, toward the weapons cabinet, toward the ledgers that documented his wealth and status and identity. Hoffman's body was already cooling when the colonel arrived. The fire had consumed most of the first floor, but the metal cabinet had shielded its contents. The colonel wrapped his coat around his hand, forced the hot metal door open, and began pulling out ledgers. The ceiling came down on him before he could save even half of them. He died instantly, crushed beneath burning beams, surrounded by the documents that had meant more to him than his wife, his children, or his own humanity. Catherine, meanwhile, had made it down the stairs through a combination of adrenaline, maternal desperation, and sheer bloody-minded determination. The first floor was an inferno, but a door knocked from its hinges had created a draft that kept one narrow path temporarily passable. She stumbled through it, both babies screaming from the heat and smoke, and emerged into the pre-dawn air. She collapsed immediately, both arms locked around her son's, unable to take another step. Solomon was already kneeling beside her. "I didn't think you'd make it out," he said quietly. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the babies, both of them, with an expression she couldn't read. "Are you going to kill me?" Catherine asked. The question seemed reasonable given the circumstances. "No," Solomon said. "I'm going to help you escape. But we need to move quickly. The neighboring planters will have seen the fire by now. People will be coming." He helped her stand, supported her weight as they moved away from the burning house toward the tree line. Behind them, Magnolia Creek's main house collapsed inward with a sound like God breaking kindling, sending sparks spiraling into the lightening sky. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when Catherine's legs gave out entirely. She sat heavily on the ground, still clutching both babies, leaving a trail of blood behind her. "I can't," she gasped. "I'm sorry. I can't go any further." Solomon looked back toward the plantation, calculating. Then he made a decision. "Give me one," he said. "What?" "Give me one of the babies. I'll take him north to freedom. You take the other, go to your family in Charleston. If we split up, if we separate the twins, there's a better chance that at least one of them survives. If we stay together, we all die when they catch us." Catherine looked down at the two tiny faces in her arms. The pale one, the dark one, the colonel's son, and Solomon's son, brothers who would never know each other if she agreed. "Which one?" she whispered. "That's your choice. I'll take whichever one you give me." The impossible decision. The choice no mother should ever have to make, but Catherine understood the logic, understood that Solomon was offering the only real chance either child had. Slowly, carefully, she handed him the darker twin, Solomon's biological son, the child whose existence had set this entire catastrophe in motion. "His name is Thomas," she said, "after my brother. Promise me you'll remember that. Promise me he'll know he was named for someone. I promise." Solomon took the baby with surprising gentleness, cradled him against his chest. "What about the other one?" Catherine looked down at the pale baby still in her arms, the colonel's heir, the child meant to carry on the Beaumont legacy. "James," she said. "I'll call him James." Solomon nodded once. Then he turned and melted into the forest without another word. Catherine never saw him again. She sat there another minute, alone with James, listening to the sounds of Magnolia Creek destroying itself, the fire, the screams, the chaos. Then she forced herself upright one final time and began walking south, toward the river, toward Charleston, towards some impossible future. She made it approximately 2 miles before a search party from a neighboring plantation found her. By then, she had lost consciousness from blood loss, but James was still alive, still crying, still demanding his mother's attention with the insistent voice that belongs to all newborns. The official story, as entered into county records and newspaper accounts from August 1847, read as follows. Magnolia Creek Plantation suffered a catastrophic fire of suspicious origin on the night of August 11th. Colonel Richard Beaumont perished in the attempt to rescue valuable documents from the flames. His wife, Catherine Beaumont, survived along with one infant son, James Beaumont, born that same evening. Approximately 263 enslaved people took advantage of the chaos to attempt escape. Most were recaptured within the week and sold down river to plantations in Louisiana and Texas. The ringleaders were never definitively identified, though several suspects were hanged as examples. Mrs. Catherine Beaumont, traumatized by events and weakened by childbirth, was committed to the care of her family in Charleston and later transferred to a private sanitarium for treatment of nervous exhaustion and hysteria. That was the official story, but like most official stories in the antebellum South, it was constructed from convenient lies and strategic omissions. The truth was messier, darker, and far more complicated. Catherine did return to Charleston, not as a broken woman requiring institutionalization. Her brother Thomas, upon reading the letter she had hidden inside her Bible, miraculously recovered from the ruins by an enslaved woman who had deliberately saved it, understood exactly what had happened at Magnolia Creek. He used his family's connections to ensure Catherine was placed in a sanitarium that was, in practice, a discreet boarding house for women escaping impossible situations. She lived there quietly under an assumed name for 2 years, raising James away from public scrutiny. The baby thrived. He grew into a healthy, intelligent child who knew nothing of his father's cruelty or his mother's desperate choices. Catherine told him, when he was old enough to ask, that his father had died heroically trying to save others from a fire. It was close enough to the truth to salve her conscience. In 1849, Catherine remarried a modest merchant from Savannah who asked few questions about her past and treated James as his own son. They had 3 more children together, and Catherine lived to see all of them reach adulthood. She never spoke publicly about Magnolia Creek. On the rare occasions when someone recognized her name and asked about the tragedy, she would smile politely and say it was all so long ago and so painful that she preferred not to dwell on it. But privately, in journals she kept hidden until her death in 1891, Catherine wrote extensively about that night, about Solomon, about the choice she had made to separate her sons, about the guilt that followed her every day. Not guilt for betraying the colonel, but for not being brave enough to keep both babies, to somehow save them both. She wrote, "I tell myself I did the only thing possible, that splitting them gave each boy a chance at life they wouldn't have had together. But I dream of Thomas, the son I gave away, and wonder who he became, whether Solomon kept his promise. Whether my baby lived to see freedom or died in some cotton field, nameless and forgotten, James will inherit money and standing. But Thomas, if he survived, inherited something that may have been more valuable, the possibility of actual freedom. I hope it was worth it. I hope I didn't simply condemn him to a different kind of death. As for Solomon and Thomas, their story grows harder to trace. In the chaos of the Magnolia Creek fire, approximately 47 enslaved people successfully escaped and were never recaptured, an unusually high number, suggesting that Solomon's planning had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. There are fragmentary records, carefully vague, deliberately incomplete, suggesting that a tall black man traveling with an infant made it to Cincinnati, Ohio by late 1847. From there, the trail goes cold. In the context of the Underground Railroad, that often meant successful passage into Canada. In 1852, a man named Solomon Turner, note the slight change of surname, appeared in the records of Chatham, Ontario, a settlement known for welcoming fugitive slaves. He worked as a carpenter. Contemporary descriptions noted he was literate and intelligent. He lived alone, except for a young boy he claimed as his son. The child, approximately 5 years old, was named Thomas and had notably lighter skin than his father. This could be coincidence. Chatham was full of fugitive slaves rebuilding their lives under new names, many with complex family histories shaped by the fractures of slavery. But the details align too precisely to dismiss the name, the timing, the child's appearance, Solomon's documented literacy. If this was indeed the same Solomon from Magnolia Creek, he had kept his promise. Thomas Turner grew up learning carpentry from his father, learning to read and write, learning that he was not property but a person. Thomas again, if he was the same Thomas born on that violent August night, married in 1867, became a schoolteacher and community organizer, and lived until 1904. His obituary in the Chatham Planet described him as a pillar of the community, a devoted educator, and a man of quiet dignity. There was no mention of his origins, no reference to Mississippi or Magnolia Creek or the night of his birth. Just the simple facts of a life lived in freedom. Meanwhile, back in Mississippi, the Magnolia Creek fire became a cautionary tale whispered between planters over whiskey and cards. The story mutated in the telling, becoming less about human choices and more about the inherent danger of enslaved people, the perpetual threat of rebellion, the necessity of harsh discipline to maintain order. The fact that the rebellion had been catalyzed by a white woman's decision was largely erased from the narrative. Too shameful, too threatening to the racial hierarchy that undergirded everything, the land sat empty for 3 years before being purchased by a speculator from Natchez. He cleared the ruins, rebuilt more modestly, and operated it as a cotton farm with a smaller enslaved workforce. But the plantation never recovered its former prominence. Crops failed regularly. Buildings suffered inexplicable damage. Workers reported feeling uneasy in the fields where the old quarters had stood. The property changed hands 7 times between 1850 and 1900. Each owner staying only a few years before selling at a loss. The pattern suggested less a supernatural curse and more a practical reality. The land's reputation made it difficult to hire overseers or purchase enslaved people willing to work there. Memory, even half-true memory, carries power. During the Civil War, Union forces burned what remained of the main house in the Vicksburg campaign. After that, the Magnolia Creek property was subdivided and sold off in pieces. By the early 20th century, nothing remained to mark where the plantation had stood, except some foundation stones and a small cluster of grave markers in what had been the family cemetery. One of those markers read, Margaret Beaumont, March 8, April 8, 1008, 145, gone too soon, the colonel's first daughter, whose death had been the beginning of everything that followed. Catherine had made certain, before leaving Mississippi, that the child's grave was properly marked. It was the only acknowledgement of a life that had lasted just 3 weeks, but whose end had cracked open her mother's carefully constructed denial about who her husband truly was. The historical record contains one final curious document, discovered in a trunk of papers donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives in 1967 by a descendant of Thomas Stratford, Catherine's brother. It is a letter dated September 3, 1890, written in the shaking hand of an elderly woman. The letter is unsigned, but the handwriting matches Catherine's journals. It is addressed simply, "To Thomas, if you still live." The letter reads, "I am an old woman now, with death approaching more quickly than I'd like. My son James is 53 years old, a successful attorney in Atlanta. a father himself to children who never knew their grandfather's cruelty. I have lived a good life, much longer than I deserved given my choices and their consequences, but I write this not to confess or seek absolution. I write because I want someone to know the truth about the night you were born. The official histories will record only fire and rebellion and a mad woman's delusions. They will not record that 2 boys were born that night, brothers, one pale and one dark, separated by fear and necessity and an impossible choice. They will not record that your father, Solomon Tutwiler, was the bravest and most intelligent man I ever knew, and that whatever passed between us that afternoon in May was less betrayal than mutual survival. They will not record that he organized a rebellion so precisely that 47 people found freedom because of it, or that he risked everything to help a white woman escape her prison, even after she had used him for her own desperate purposes. They will not record that I think of you every day, that I wonder who you became, whether you are alive or dead, free or enslaved, at peace or broken, that I carry the guilt of separating you from your brother like a stone in my chest, knowing it was necessary, but hating that it was necessary. If you live, if somehow this letter finds you, know that you are wanted, that you were named for someone who mattered to me, that your birth, however violent and complicated, was not shameful but defiant, that you were loved even in the moment I had to let you go. I hope Solomon kept his promise. I hope you found freedom. I hope you never learned the hatred I watched consume so many, though you had every reason to embrace it. Your mother, Catherine, the letter was never sent. Catherine died in Charleston on November 3rd, 1891, at age 70, having never found a way to deliver those words to the son she had given away. The letter passed through James's family line, a mystery none of her descendants could fully understand or explain. The official records of Issaquah County contain only the barest facts about Magnolia Creek, the fire, the deaths, the property transfers. They don't mention twins. They don't mention Solomon Tutwiler by name. He appears only as ringleader, identity unknown, presumed escaped. They certainly don't mention Catherine's choice, or the medical phenomenon that made it possible, or the 15-year-old girl whose assault had been the final spark. But absence of documentation doesn't mean absence of truth. It simply means that some truths were too dangerous to record, too shameful to acknowledge, too threatening to the social order that men like Colonel Beaumont had built their entire world upon. In the years following the Magnolia Creek fire, similar incidents increased across the Deep South. Small rebellions, mysterious fires, unexplained disappearances of enslaved people in larger numbers than usual. The system that depended on absolute control was discovering that absolute control was impossible to maintain indefinitely. Every crack created opportunities, and desperate people became very skilled at finding opportunities. The Civil War would arrive 14 years after that August night, bringing with it the legal end of the institution that had made tragedies like Magnolia Creek inevitable. But the war wouldn't erase what had happened, wouldn't undo the separations, wouldn't heal wounds that ran deep enough to mark entire generations. James Beaumont grew up believing his father had been a stern but honorable man who died trying to save others. He became an attorney, as his mother had hoped, and quietly used his position to help freed slaves navigate the legal system during Reconstruction. He never knew he had a twin brother, never knew his mother had made an impossible choice in fire and blood, never knew that his very existence was tied to an act of desperate rebellion that had cost dozens of lives. He died in 1902, respected and surrounded by family, carrying the Beaumont name into the 20th century, entirely ignorant of the violence and tragedy that had shaped his origins. As for Solomon and Thomas, their trail ends somewhere beyond Mississippi. Whether they made it north, whether they found the freedom Solomon had been planning toward, whether Thomas grew up knowing his true story or lived his whole life believing a gentler one, these questions have no definitive answers. The absence of records could mean death, or it could mean successful escape into a life where documentation was deliberately avoided, where the past was intentionally obscured, where survival meant becoming invisible to the very system that had once claimed ownership. Perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion to their story: uncertainty. The same uncertainty Catherine lived with every day for 44 years. The same uncertainty that haunted her enough to write that letter in her final year, knowing she would never send it, needing to write it anyway. What is certain is this: on August 12, 1847, in a small corner of Mississippi, the systems of power and control that seemed absolute were revealed to be fragile. A woman made a choice that destroyed her marriage and her social position, but possibly saved her children. A man who had been treated as property for 24 years proved capable of organizing a rebellion sophisticated enough that nearly 50 people found freedom. And 2 babies were born whose very existence challenged every assumption the society around them was built upon. The fire that consumed Magnolia Creek burned for 3 days, visible for miles in every direction. Neighboring planters watched the smoke rise and understood that what had happened there could happen anywhere. That fear, legitimate, well-founded fear, changed how they treated their enslaved people, at least briefly. More food, fewer whippings, a slight loosening of absolute control, just enough to relieve some pressure. It didn't last. Within a year, most plantations had returned to their previous practices, the lesson of Magnolia Creek forgotten or willfully ignored. But for a brief moment, something had shifted. Power had revealed itself to be conditional, not absolute. And that revelation, once glimpsed, could not be completely unseen. The land where Magnolia Creek Plantation once stood changed hands many times in the decades that followed, each owner staying only briefly before selling at a loss. Locals avoided it, claiming the soil was cursed, that crops grew poorly there, that animals refused to graze certain fields. More likely, the land simply carried too much memory, too much pain soaked into its soil, too many ghosts. Not supernatural ones, the weight of history, of violence, of choices made and lives destroyed. Some places hold their past that way, refusing to release it, insisting that those who come after acknowledge what happened there. By 1900, most of the Magnolia Creek property had been broken into small farms worked by sharecroppers, many of them formerly enslaved people or their children, working the same soil their ancestors had been forced to work under very different circumstances. The old main house was completely gone, reclaimed by kudzu and time. The quarters were gone. Even the cemetery had been largely abandoned, its stones weathered and leaning, most names no longer legible. Only Margaret's marker remained clear, protected by its marble, and perhaps by Catherine's determination that her daughter not be entirely forgotten. Gone too soon, in a way that could have been the epitaph for everyone touched by the events of August 1847. Everyone had been taken too soon by death, by separation, by choices they should never have been forced to make. This story reminds us that the most terrifying horrors in history were not supernatural. They were the systems human beings created and maintained, the casual cruelties they justified, the impossible choices they forced upon one another. The real horror of Magnolia Creek was not in ghosts or curses. It was in the documented, legal, socially sanctioned practices that made a night like August 11th, 1847 inevitable. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Catherine made the right choice in separating her sons? Could there have been another way, or was this the only path to survival? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more historical mysteries like it, subscribe to Horror Echoes, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who appreciates the darker corners of American history. These stories need to be told, need to be remembered, need to be understood, not to judge the people who lived them, but to ensure we never again create the conditions that made such choices necessary. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.